Okay, last week we talked about Christianity as the bedrock of the United States. Now, this week we're going to look at the Declaration of Independence as the foundation. We stopped with the Fundamentals Orders of Connecticut, and tonight I'm going to touch a little bit on what led up to the Declaration of Independence and some of the thoughts about what was in the Declaration of Independence before we look at and actually read it. Today it's popular in history to actually put down the idea that the colonists had any reason to revolt, that there was no real good reason to revolt. They make a case like it was just the Stamp Act and the Tea Act and a bunch of folks who didn't like taxes decided to revolt. Well, that's not the case. All 13 colonies here in this country were privately financed except one. They were privately financed for commerce or religious freedom. The only colony that was not privately financed originally was Georgia. Georgia was the brainchild of James Oglethorpe, and it was to Georgia that they brought people released from debtor's prison in England. So Georgia got some grants from Parliament. It was the only one of the colonies to ever get grant money, government money of any kind. The rest of the colonies were all privately funded. All 13 of those colonies had either a charter or a treaty with England. Those charters, the English government committed in those charters to honor the rights of the colonists, rights as Englishmen. First off, the colonists had all the rights that Englishmen had. That would be due process, right to representation, fair taxation. But on top of that, they had the right to trade in any nation or place that they wanted. That was a right of Englishmen. They could not be taxed without the consent of their legislature. That was a right that was for Englishmen and was given to them in those charters. Under those charters, England could send no troops to America without the colonists' consent, and they had the right to resist any invasion by force. Now, the first of those ordinary rights were violated again and again. The king would suspend legislatures, he would ignore legislatures, Parliament would ignore petitions, they passed taxes. They did a great many things that violated the normal rights of Englishmen, and this didn't go on over a period of 1 or 2 years. This went on for a couple of decades. This was not something that happened overnight. And it wasn't until England violated the major two rights in their eyes, that would be due process and sending troops to be quartered to invade here in this country, that they wound up revolting. Now, when I say due process, in this country we think that due process is going through the courts and then you get up to the Supreme Court and that's final decision. Well, that's not the case in England then or now. In England, Parliament is the final court of resort, not a high court. Parliament is the final court of resort in England, and they were refusing to hear petitions from the colonists. We know that in 1775, shots were fired at Concord and Lexington. Everybody remembers that from history, correct? Now, how many people in here have ever heard of the Olive Branch petition? They don't talk about that very much in American history. Even after the shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord, the Colonial Congress, Second Continental Congress, decided to write an Olive Branch petition. Now, first they had Thomas Jefferson write it and decided it was too bellicose. So John Dickinson rewrote it and sent it to England. In that petition, it was written with extreme humility and conciliation. It proclaimed loyalty to England and the king and a desire for restoration of harmony between the colonials and England. They didn't want to separate, even after Lexington and Concord. Now, the king knew that that petition was coming, so he ordered the Army and the Navy to the colonies before the petition could get to Parliament. The argument, I think, can very effectively be made that it was not so much a war of revolution as a war of defense. England started the war, not the colonists, and it went on from there. When we think about the ideas that would come up in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, those things, a lot of people have written about what those mean. Frederick Bastiat wrote that life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. The laws arise out of their existence. Property, liberty, those come before the laws do. And one that I like was in 1921, Supreme Court Justice George Sutherland. He was talking to the New York Bar Association, and I like it because it was a Supreme Court justice in the 20th century. He said, "It is not the right of property which is protected, but the right to property. Property per se has no rights, but the individual, the man, has three great rights, equally sacred from arbitrary interference: the right to his life, the right to his liberty, and the right to his property. The three rights are so bound together as to be one right. To give a man his life but deny him his liberty, is to take from him all that makes life worth living. To give him his liberty, but take from him the property which is the fruit and badge of his liberty, is still to leave him a slave. So a lot of people have thought about the ideas contained in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and what people don't understand today is there is an absolute interdependence of those two documents. You cannot separate the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. For virtually every part of the Declaration, the Constitution addresses it in context. For example, at the end, when you see all the complaints against the king, the usurpations, the rights that the king tried to take, there is a passage in the Constitution to prevent such an abuse. In other words, the Declaration of Independence defines a problem, and the Constitution addresses it with a practical answer. And if you look at those two documents side by side, you'll see how that happens. We'll look at it some here, but if you really want to look at it and understand it, you're going to have to do some reading on your own. On the bicentennial of the United States Constitution, there was a federal commission, nice gala group, and what they had to say was the Declaration of Independence was the promise, the Constitution was the fulfillment. We look at things a little bit different today than they did when they wrote the Declaration and the Constitution. So I'm going to give you two definitions of liberty. The first definition is from Webster's 1828 dictionary. It says, 1, liberty is the freedom from restraint in a general sense. But then it goes on to say in a much larger definition, civil liberty is the liberty of men in a state of society, or natural liberty, so far only abridged and restrained as is necessary and expedient for the safety and interest of the society, state, or nation. A restraint of natural liberty, not necessary or expedient for the public, is tyranny or oppression. Civil liberty is an exemption from the arbitrary will of others, which exemption is secured by established laws which restrain every man from injuring or controlling another. Hence, the restraints of law are essential to liberty. Now, here's a 1984 definition of liberty from Webster's Collegiate Dictionary. The quality or state of being free, a right or immunity enjoyed by prescription or grant. In 1828, we had natural liberty, and they were not afraid to use the words tyranny and oppression. And in 1984, a college dictionary says liberty's what the government grants you. It's what you get by grant or petition. That's a big change in not too long a period of time. So Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and I think there's a lot of confusion today as to exactly who Thomas Jefferson was and who Thomas Jefferson wasn't. When Thomas Jefferson was 9 years old, he began the study of Greek, Latin, and French. At the age of 16, he was admitted to William Mary College as an advanced student. At the age of 19, he graduated from William Mary College. And then he began 5 years of intense study under George Wythe for the law. George Wythe was America's first professor of law. He was a very demanding instructor and mentor. He turned out some of the finest legal minds of all time. He required the study not just of law, but of language, history, and political theory. So under him, Thomas Jefferson was familiar not just with Blackstone and the history of English law, but he was well versed in Plato and Cicero, the history of Greece and Rome. He was familiar with ancient Israeli history, and Thomas Jefferson learned Anglo-Saxon so that he could read Anglo-Saxon history and law in its original language. As that kind of student, Thomas Jefferson understood absolutely the difference between common law and civil law. They are two very, very different forms of law. Common law is that which is derived from God and God's nature. Civil law is always that which is derived from a fictitious. A fictitious is like when we talked last week about William the Conqueror, the king. After the Norman invasion of England in 1066, William the Conqueror declared that all land was his to give away. That's a fictitious. The king and his claims are a fictitious. A king, a government, an entity like that is a fictitious when they take command. That's where civil law always comes from. Common law is the law of liberty, God and God's nature, and under common law, the only thing that men cannot do are the things that are forbidden. Anything not expressly forbidden, they are free to do. Under civil law, which is the law of restraint, men can only do what the law says they can do. They can't do anything else. And it's important to understand those two differences as we look at the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, because they each represent one of those and not the other. A lot of people today tend to think of Thomas Jefferson as some kind of almost atheist in the way they apply what they think Thomas Jefferson stood for. It's not at all true. Thomas Jefferson was a Unitarian. He did attend church services. He believed in intercessory prayer. What Thomas Jefferson did not believe in was the miracles of the Bible. But when you really want to understand what someone believes in, you do what I taught all of my children. I taught my children to listen respectfully to what people say, and then watch what they do, because a combination of the two will tell you what they believe in, and what they do will often tell you a great deal more than what they say. In April of 1802, as President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson extended the Congressional Act of 1787, in which the federal government designated lands for Christian Indians and the Moravian Christian Brotherhood. The federal government had been doing that since 1787. Jefferson extended that. At his urging, in 1803, Congress passed a treaty with the Kaskaskia Indians where the federal government would pay for the support of a Catholic priest to the Kaskaskia Indians for 7 years. Those are not the acts of someone who says no religion in government. All Thomas Jefferson ever believed in was no government in religion, no government controlling religion. He never believed that God should be out of government. Later in 1803, Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to Dr. Benjamin Rush, because even in his day people were questioning his beliefs. Here's what he had to say. My views are the result of a life of inquiry and reflection, and very different from the anti-Christian system imputed to me by those who know nothing of my opinions. To the corruption of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian in the only sense in which he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others. I don't think anybody could make an argument that Thomas Jefferson fit into the mold of what we would call today a fundamental Christian. However, he most certainly viewed himself as a Christian in principle, and he believed in applying those principles in life and government. If you look at the things Jefferson said, we're going to look at some other quotes from him and some of the founders, you understand that if you try to separate Judeo-Christian history in the Bible from our documents, they become meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. So I'm going to give you 5 quotes. The first 3 are from Thomas Jefferson. Can the liberties of a nation be thought secure when we have removed their only firm basis, a conviction in the minds of the people that these liberties are the gift of God, that they are not to be violated but with his wrath? I tremble for my country when I reflect that his justice cannot sleep forever. Another quote by Jefferson. The reason that Christianity is the best friend of government is because Christianity is the only religion that changes the heart. And he went on to say, I have always said and always will say that the studious perusal of the sacred volume will make better citizens, better fathers, better husbands. The Bible makes the best people in the world. Now, does that sound to you like a man who is ambivalent about his beliefs in Christian principles? Here's one from John Adams about the Declaration itself. The Declaration of Independence laid the cornerstone of human government upon the first precepts of Christianity. And now George Washington. It is impossible to rightly govern the world without God and the Bible. These men knew exactly what they believed. They applied what they believed to what they wrote. And if you try to take God out of what they wrote, it's no longer workable. So the Declaration of Independence is our nation's foundation. It lays down the political philosophy on which the Constitution would later be erected, and to turn political theory upside down. I told you a minute ago, you have to keep in mind the difference between common law and civil law. The Declaration of Independence proclaims the common law of liberty for individuals, for the people of this nation. It is the Declaration of Independence under which the people of this nation are ruled, common law. The Constitution was written by a fictitious, never seen before in the world. Do you remember how the preamble of the Constitution opens? We, the people, in order to form a more perfect union. The people are the new fictitious, laying a civil law of restraint on government and government only. When we look at the Constitution next week, we're going to talk about that. But if you go home for the rest of this week and read the Constitution from beginning to end, you will find not one line that talks about what the people can or cannot do, only government. The people of this nation were intended to be under the common law of liberty, the Declaration of Independence, and the government was intended to be under the civil law of restraint, the Constitution. So we have something that nobody's ever seen before. We have a duality of law, and hopefully by the end of the 4 weeks we'll have a better understanding of how all that works. If you try to take away the Declaration of Independence, which is what has been done a lot in schools, what little bit of constitutional study they do doesn't talk about the Declaration of Independence. Without that, the Constitution loses all of its moral basis. It has nothing to stand on without the Declaration of Independence. To understand a little bit more about Jefferson's frame of mind when he wrote the Declaration of Independence, last week I talked some about Exodus, and I talked a little bit about the Anglo-Saxons. Thomas Jefferson got his first inspirations for representative government from Exodus, from looking at what Jethro helped Moses to create under a covenant of law with selected leaders, the first representative government ever in history. Jefferson recognized that. It was one of the two things that he would call the ancient principles throughout his writings. If you read Thomas Jefferson, you will see him refer again and again to the ancient principles. That was referring, one, to ancient Israeli history in Exodus, and two, to the Anglo-Saxons. Now, the Anglo-Saxons came to England around 450 AD, and they had a governmental system almost identical to ancient Israel. And the reason for that probably is because the Anglo-Saxons or Yinglids came from the Black Sea region. Well, if you go back and look at history, it is the Black Sea region in which the 10 northern tribes of Israel disappeared in captivity. Now, whether it was through descent, intermarriage, or just seeing a governing system that worked so well, it is pretty unreasonable to believe that the Anglo-Saxons came up with a system identical to the ancient Israeli system just all on their own, because they both had a system that was set up on voting for the 10s, 50s, 100s, thousands. They had many of the same outlooks in the way they governed their people, the same kind of rules. So at the very least, they had to have seen the governing of those 10 tribes that were in captivity and said, hey, that looks pretty good to me. Let's jot this down. I like the way that's working. Jefferson noted that as long as the Israelites followed that original form of government that God gave them, they flourished, and when they turned away from it, they had nothing but disaster. So we have Thomas Jefferson's ancient principles based on two groups, and I'm going to give you a list of things that were common to both those groups. You will find these things in Exodus and in Deuteronomy if you read them. You will find all of these principles. That's where we would find them most clearly laid out because we don't read ancient Anglo-Saxon, but they had the same ideas. So for both societies, A, they were a commonwealth of free men. B, they had a strong commitment to basic morality. C, they were organized to allow adults a voice and a vote. D, the major emphasis was on strong local government. E, they had honest money backed by gold and silver and honest weights and measures. F, land was in the private stewardship of the people, not the government. G, the rights of property were protected. F, the rights of life and private property were protected. I, all the leaders were picked by a majority of the people or their representatives. J, all their laws were approved by a majority of the people or their representatives. K, accused people were innocent until proven guilty. Find a good exposition of that in Deuteronomy. Government was from the people up, not from the government down. Government was required to operate under law, not just on the whims of men. You remember we talked last week about the Israelis being under a covenant of law, the 10 Commandments. They were under law. And because of all of this, it allowed for a peaceful transfer of power. When you read Moses, hands on to Joshua, Joshua hands on as you go all through up until Saul, you've got people handing power over peacefully, no battle over who's going to be the new leader. So to sum up the importance of these cultures, the way that they were looked at and weighed by Jefferson, and to give another idea as to how much he was a believer in God and religion being a part of government, the members of the Continental Congress were asked to submit their own ideas for what the official seal of the United States should look like. Has anybody ever seen a drawing of what the official seal of the United States would have looked like if Thomas Jefferson's idea had been adopted? Has anybody ever seen it? Thomas Jefferson wanted on the face of the official seal of the United States the tribes of Israel following a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night on the official seal of the United States of America. On the obverse side, which would have been a less important side, he wanted the faces of Hengist and Horsa, the two legendary Anglo-Saxon brothers who first went to England in 450 A.D. So his two ancient principles on the official seal of the United States, but with the most important of those ancient principles being on the face side of that seal, the tribes of Israel, the cloud, and the pillar of fire. Now, folks, none of those things, not his actions in office, his writings, nor things like that, to me seem pretty obvious that Thomas Jefferson believed very much that God was a part of life and that God was a part of government. And I think now we'll turn to the Declaration of Independence, because in the Declaration we're going to find, again, just how much Thomas Jefferson believed in God. But we're going to start at the beginning, because the first paragraph of the Declaration of Independence is what's known as an apologetic. That means it's a statement to other nations, other people, as to why the Declaration was being written. It says, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. In the second paragraph is what I believe to be one of the greatest paragraphs written anywhere in all of European, all of American history. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and accordingly all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having been in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance, unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained, and when so suspended he has utterly neglected to attend to them. I'm going to stop there for a moment because there's a long list of things that the colonists were angry about. But I want us to think about common law and what Thomas Jefferson was saying. He begins in that first chapter, the laws of nature and nature's God, the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle us. And then we go on to that second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That means that they are obvious to anyone who has more common sense than a rutabaga. Anyone can understand self-evident truth. All men are created equal. Now, I know when we get into the Constitution, we'll see that there were some definite mistakes made around that particular idea. But that doesn't take away the truth that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator, by God, not by government, not by man, by God, with certain unalienable rights. Unalienable is a legal term that means cannot be mortgaged by anyone. That is what the term unalienable means. Cannot be taken, cannot be mortgaged by anyone. Among these, but not exclusive to these, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we talked about that last week. If you look at the Bible from the very beginning, God gave us life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thomas Jefferson recognized that. He made it immortal in the Declaration of Independence. He goes on to tell us that it is our right and duty to change government when it stops doing what we told government to do. These are some of the reasons that I say that the people of this nation were intended to be under common law. Nowhere in the Constitution does it tell the government to go get new people. But the Declaration of Independence tells us absolutely, if we are oppressed by tyrants in our own nation, it is not only our right but our duty and responsibility to change that government. And note, I am not telling everybody to go home, grab guns, and march on Washington, D.C. That's not what I'm talking about. We have the power to change things at the poll, if we will. But back to the Declaration of Independence. It's important to look at the list of what the colonists viewed as a long train of abuses and usurpations. It's especially good to look at it before we go to the Constitution next week and before we get to the Bill of Rights at the end and decide whether we have been abused and usurped over the last few years. So the king refused his assent to laws. That's a violation of the Magna Carta that we talked about, that the king was under the law. With the colonists, he refused to be under the law, forbidding his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. Most of the people who came here to be governors were like the administrative appointees in Washington, D.C. They're not there to do anything. They're there to collect graft, make money, and get political payoff. That's why they're there. That's why these governors were here. They weren't here to actually do anything for anybody. The king and parliament did indeed refuse to pass laws that were necessary for the colonies unless the colonies would agree to give up their legislatures their right to representation. Then the king and parliament would help them out. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual and uncomfortable and distant from the depository of their public records. In other words, it would be telling people from Virginia, you're going to assemble in New York. Or telling people in New York, well, we're having a 2-hour meeting on Saturday and we're having it in Los Angeles. That was the way that the king was treating the legislatures of the individual colonies. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. And that's true. Every time that the colonial legislatures would send a petition, the king would just dissolve the legislature. Don't have to worry about the petition then. He's refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected. That was true. He left people without representation again and again. He's endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing the laws of naturalization. He did do that. He fought to keep people from emigrating to the colonies and having them grow in size and power. Obstructed the administration of justice. Again, the colonials were getting no justice from the courts, from Parliament, from the king. He's made judges dependent on his will alone. Imagine that. The king, the highest executive in the country, was giving judgeships only to partisans who agreed with what he wanted to do. Who would ever imagine such a thing? He has erected a multitude of new czars, new offices, and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of the legislature. He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. Sound familiar? He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. The king wanted the colonies to submit to the Human Rights Charter of the United Nations, quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, protecting those troops by a mock trial, cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, imposing taxes on us without consent, depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, abolishing the free system of English laws, taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our governments, suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here, declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us, plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts. At that time, the colonies were facing large armies of foreign mercenaries. He constrained citizens of the colonies, taken captive on the high seas to bear arms then against the colonies, excited domestic insurrections among the people. In each stage of these oppressions, they petitioned for redress, and those petitions were answered by more injury. They did warn Parliament time and again that what was being done to them was wrong, that it needed to stop. But then we go to the last paragraph in the Declaration of Independence. And after I read that, we're going to go back and look at some of those usurpations, because what they say in this last paragraph is some of what we need today. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things for which independent states may of right do. And now, this is the part that we need today. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Those were not empty words on a political campaign. Those men literally gave their fortunes, some their lives, and stood absolutely on their honor. When Hale was captured by the British and hung as a spy, do you remember what his words were? They're famous words in American history. That's right. I regret that I have but one life to give for my country. They had honor, and they meant what they said. We chuckled a couple of times as we looked at some of the things that were in here because they sounded familiar. An executive that has refused to abide by the law. That was King George of England. That was King George of Bush. That's King Obama. That was King Clinton. For years and years, both parties have played us off of one another while they both broke the law at all levels of federal government. He's forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance. 50 states in this union, and the federal government tells them they're not allowed to use the powers that are granted to them under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Dissolved representative houses repeatedly. Now, they haven't dissolved houses, but they've done their best to render all local and state representation null and void. Obstructed the administration of justice. I would say in a way the federal courts are handled with appointments that we have not had justice in the United States courts for decades. We've had a legal system. We have not had a justice system. He's made judges dependent on his will alone. Judges in this country are dependent on the two political parties. Erected a multitude of new offices. Every time we turn around, there's some new administration. Millions and billions of dollars going to some new great plan that's supposed to help the people of this nation. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies. Now, not all of this is true because it's had the consent of our legislature, Congress. But the truth is we have had large standing army in this nation for a very long time, since the end of World War II, and it was never intended that we have a military this large all of the time, and we have not had a defensive military position for a long time, but an offensive one. He's combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. We have had judges in the last few years try to refer to international law in the courts of the United States of America. We have had legislative and administrative representatives tell us that we should be abiding by the international courts and by United Nations laws. And we have even had a judge recently in the United States try a man for the horrendous beating of his wife. The man was a Muslim. The judge apologized to that man for hearing him under our laws instead of Sharia law and dismissed the case here in the United States. I don't think anybody would question that we have taxes imposed on us without our consent. Abolishing the free system of English laws, they've been abolishing the free system of our laws for a long time. Taking away our charters, yep, you betcha. We are supposed to be a nation of liberty. And I will submit to you again that the people of this nation are supposed to be under the common law of liberty of the Declaration of Independence. That is our rule, and it is up to us to stand on that rule. I'm not going to try to read the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights tonight, but I just read the Declaration of Independence. If you read the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it sounds very lofty, sounds very appealing, until you notice that there is no mention of God, no mention of natural law and liberty. The entire document known as the United Nations Charter on Human Rights, submitted in 1947, is a document calling for socialism. Socialism is a 20th century sanitized word for tyranny, and that is all that the United Nations Charter calls for. Where our Declaration of Independence invests our rights in a creator, the United Nations Charter invests rights in a Security Council. When Alexis de Tocqueville toured this nation in the 1800s, he was amazed at what he saw. A melding of political thought and understanding with Christian faith and Christian work ethic. He couldn't believe the way that it blended. And he wrote a great many things about this nation, and he wrote about political theory in general. Well, here's what de Tocqueville had to say about democracy and socialism. He said, democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word, equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality and liberty, socialism seeks equality and restraint and servitude. Now, I know there are some documents that the folks in this room have never read, but how many of you have ever read Pogo, the comic strip by Walt Kelly? Well, Walt Kelly also had a definition of socialism that's easier to understand, and I love it. The definition is this: the shortages will be divided among the peasants. Next week, the Constitution. But without the Declaration of Independence, there is no Constitution. People need to understand that. We need to understand that deep inside. And without a moral basis of God, unalienable rights, there is no liberty. There's just not. Because whenever rights are deemed to come from man, that means they can be taken by man. Anytime, anywhere, under any whim. When they're given by God, it can't be taken by anybody unless we let it happen. So, do you have some questions about the Declaration of Independence, about common law versus civil law?
I have a question, not specifically about the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
But in your opinion, where did we flip it? At what point in history did we divide the two? Do you have a feel for that?
I'm going to talk more about it next week because I'm going to hit some specific dates and things that happened. The truth is, if you go back and read about the progressives in the early 1900s, they laid out exactly what needed to be done to change this nation over to a nation of socialism. One of the very first things that had to be done was to eliminate God from public discourse in the United States of America. It's right at the top of their list. It's at the top of the list of the progressives, who didn't necessarily call themselves socialists, and the socialists and communists who did call themselves socialists and communists. Both said the same thing. You have to remove God from the American conscience, and it was a prolonged effort. It didn't happen overnight. We talk about decisions like Murray versus Curlett, 1963. Madeline Murray O'Hare, the atheist. That was the culmination of a few cases. But in Murray versus Curlett, 1963, the Supreme Court took a line, the walls of separation of church and state, out of context from a letter that Thomas Jefferson had written to the Danbury Baptist Church Association. They said, based on that line that they took out of context from that letter, that we could not have God and religion in schools, later expanded to in public. But here's the craziness about that decision in 1963. It isn't just that they took that sentence out of context. They took the sentence from a writing by Thomas Jefferson and used that writing to render their decision. Yet, when Supreme Court Justice Stewart wrote the opinion on that case, he said that what the Founding Fathers had to say about the Bible and religion is unimportant, doesn't apply. Now, the only way we know what the Founding Fathers had to say about anything is through their writings. So what the Supreme Court Justice said in his opinion is this: we are basing our decision on a writing by one of the Founding Fathers that we declare to be inadmissible evidence. Now, you figure that one out, because I never have, and I've read that decision a few times. Power always seeks more power. Control seeks more control. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't all happen in the 20th century. As a matter of fact, the power changes began to happen clear back when Thomas Jefferson was alive. That was when the Supreme Court made its first big ruling on interstate commerce, and it claimed the power for the court that cannot be found in Article 3 of the Constitution. It claimed a power for the Supreme Court to pass final judgment on the constitutionality of any law, but that's not in Article 3 of the Constitution. We'll go into some of that stuff next week, because I kind of have to go into those things in a little bit of order with a little support. You know, so many people want to lay things at the foot of one person or one group, and that's just not the way it happened. The first progressive president in the United States was not Woodrow Wilson. It was Theodore Roosevelt. Now, here's an interesting question for you. The 16th Amendment passed in 1913. Who was the first nationally known, incredibly popular political figure in 1909 to endorse the 16th Amendment that was being written for income taxes? Who was the first big, popular, nationally known political figure to endorse the 16th Amendment? Teddy Roosevelt, not Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson wasn't that popular. Teddy Roosevelt was. You have people wave this banner saying, "We're conservatives. We believe in family values." Conservative what? Conserving power? Yeah, I know you believe in that. I see that. Conserving your time in office? I see that. Conserving your pay so well that you make $178,000 a year and save $3 million? Yeah, I see that. Not quite sure how you're doing it, but I see it. I decided a couple of years back to understand what I believe in and why. I am not a liberal. I am not a conservative. I am a constitutionalist. When you are a constitutionalist, you have something to stand on. When you are a conservative or a liberal, that is standing on shifting sand that has no real meaning. But to be a constitutionalist does. See, there's a dirty little secret about the Constitution that they don't teach and most people don't understand. The Constitution was not written as a balance between left and right. The Constitution won't work that way. The Constitution was written to place the people in the exact center of anarchy and tyranny. At either end of a scale that holds left and right, you have tyranny, period. We were designed to be balanced between anarchy and tyranny. No left and right. The Constitution won't work when you try to use it as a tool to balance between left and right. It doesn't work. It's not what it was designed for. So, any other questions?
When the Declaration was being written, and all these learned men, very few of them actually, I guess, got together and had their discussions and their arguments. Was there any attempt that you know of to educate the general public as to what was going on at that time? Because I see a parallel there and now. You know, we need to educate our general public a little bit, a lot.
Sure. First off, there was no television back then.
That's right.
There was no radio. There were no video games. There were no football and baseball games. So one of the biggest forms of entertainment was the newspaper. People read.
The ones that could read.
It's amazing how many people could read in this nation. That was one of the things that de Tocqueville commented on, was the high literacy rate of the people in this nation. Keep in mind, the people who came to this nation were not going to be the unwashed, illiterate, give me handouts kind of people. That's not how it started. The nation was going to be populated initially by those who were big, strong, daring, smart, willing to take a risk. They may not have had money, but they were willing to put themselves on the line to come here. And there was a high degree of literacy among those people. Remember, you had groups coming here for religious freedom. There were no tape recordings of the Bible back then. There was only one way to get the Bible. You could get it through readings of scriptures from somebody else, but people read. And they had a high degree of learning and vocabulary. I told you about Thomas Jefferson. 9 years old, he begins a study of Greek, Latin, and French. 9 years old. We don't have that kind of requirement on 19-year-olds. People who graduate from college today with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees 75 years ago would not have had the knowledge after they get their degrees that would have been needed to be admitted to college 75 years ago. I had college professors who were completely ignorant about the subject matter they were teaching, and they had tenure as college professors. I took classes from PhDs I wouldn't trust to run a hot dog stand if they had an exclusive rights in Yankee Stadium. They were that stupid, but they were teaching at the college level, and they're cranking out our knowledgeable generation now. Because I went in the 80s. They've got to be really bad by now. But to answer your question, people read newspapers. There were a lot of political speeches. If you ever go look at the Douglas-Lincoln debates, hours and hours out in the sun, giving speeches, debating. That's what they did back then.
These revolutionaries, the people that actually picked up their muskets and went and fought, had to be won over somehow. And and we need to win people over the house. I'm wondering if we can learn what they did.
Newspaper speeches, pamphlets were a big thing back then. Thomas Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, one of the best-selling documents in American history. It still sells, and it's still full of common sense.
The churches too, the preachers.
Yes.
That era actually, that's who motivated a lot of people.
If you look at the American Revolution, how many people have heard of the Black Robe Regiment? Good. Some people in here have heard of the Black Robe Regiment. During the Revolutionary War, in those days, most preachers wore a black cassock. That was their sign of office. Didn't matter what denomination. They wore a black robe, a black cassock when they preached. They were called the Black Robe Regiment because after they would preach their sermons on Sundays, when they took their robe off, underneath the robe was their sword sheath, their uniform, their pistol. They were ready to go to war. They didn't just preach. They fought for what they preached about. They were known as the Black Robe Regiment. In recent years, there have been a growing number of pastors who have started a modern Black Robe Regiment. Pastors who will stand on the Word, stand on this nation behind the podium without fear.
One of their sermons were circulated in pamphlet and booklet form as well. It was really common for Washington even. I've read a lot about him to sit at home when he'd be at home and he would read sermons to his family. And so, you know, we are so inundated with media, and all they had was printed matter and the stuff that they could go to and listen to live. And yeah, they're way smarter than most of us.
Yeah, I would not try to compare myself to the founders. I'm sorry. I read a lot. I read well. I even think I understand what I read fairly well, but I am not a Thomas Jefferson, not even remotely. Anything else about that period? You can even jump back to last week if you want. I really appreciate all of you coming here. It's important that we find a way to generate a desire among our families and our friends to understand not just the blessings of liberty and where those blessings come from, but what it takes from us to keep those blessings of liberty. It's not free. It doesn't happen sitting at home, trusting everything to work itself out and be okay. We do have to be involved. Obviously, we have to be involved at the voting booth, but if people don't know anything about the candidates when they go to the voting booth, I'd rather they stay home. Tired of people being voted in because they have the best haircut or the nicest suit. And I'm really sick of people being voted in because they offer the biggest bribes. It's just insane. I recommend to anybody, if you really want to understand the Constitution and the Declaration, don't just come to a class and listen to somebody like me. Read what the Founding Fathers wrote, because if you read Washington, Jefferson, Paine, Otis, Adams, you will know everything that they intended for this nation. And everything that you will read about them will completely contradict what our courts and our representatives try to tell us today they meant when they wrote those documents.
When you start to read them, don't get discouraged when reading them, because of the difference in our language. Just put your thinking cap on and dive in.
And if you want to know sometimes about the definition of a word, because I brought up the 1828 dictionary, today I ordered a copy of that from Amazon so I'd have one, but you can call up the 1828 Webster's Dictionary on the internet just by typing it in, and then go to words that you want to see what the difference is in the definitions. But I like holding a book, so I ordered the book today, so I have it at home.
That's invaluable.
It's huge. But it's huge, the difference in meaning. If you look at the definition of liberty in that original Webster's Dictionary, it's like this long. And then you go to Webster's Collegiate Dictionary, and it's this long. And I thank all of you for being here, and I bless every one of you, because this would be pretty boring if I was just looking out at Steve to do this.
Well, God bless you, sir, for what you're doing and all the effort you put into this.
I enjoy it.